Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today. The webinar today will provide you an overview of key players and existing financial mechanisms that enable plastic pollution to continue, as well as recommendations that are needed to actually ensure we stop plastic crisis and invest in zero waste solutions. Moving on to the next slide. And today, the event is part of the Fall Solutions Week of our Zero Waste Month. Zero Waste Month is a month-long coordinated series of events that we organize every year to put a spotlight on zero waste with global and regional events, which is led by GAIA and also our member organization across the globe, which is open for participation to all. As a reminder, and in case you don't already know, next slide, please. This event is organized by Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. We are a network of grassroots organizations, almost 1,000 organizations and groups across the globe, whose mission is a just, zero waste world, built on respect for ecological limits and community rights, where people are free from the burden of toxic pollution and resources are sustainably conserved, not burned or dumped. You can visit our website to know more about us. Next slide. And so as part of the Zero Waste Month celebrations this January, we have our amazing members and many, many allies who have organized over 200 events globally to demonstrate that zero waste solutions are not only just possible, but are happening now. And you can visit our website specifically to know more. Next slide. And just to let you know, this webinar is being brought to you by GAIA Asia Pacific's campaign unit, who are leading this week, which is dedicated to exposing false solutions such as plastic credits, bio-based plastics, waste to energy, incineration, and other expensive distractions from the industry, and why we need to ensure that precious financial resources should go towards real solutions like zero waste. You can know more about the events lined up this week and the next by visiting zerowastemonth.zerowasteasia to register. And my name, if you don't already know, is Arpita Bhagat. I am GAIA's Plastic Policy Officer for the Asia Pacific region. My work is focused on coordinating plastic policy work for our members in Asia Pacific across global and national advocacy work, specifically looking at treaty and national policies towards plastic production and reduction, advancing zero waste policies, just transition, and of course, phasing out fall solutions. Next slide. And just to remind you all, this webinar will be in English. Please make sure that your full name is displayed on your Zoom account from where you logged in, so that we are careful of not having anybody erroneous join us today. You may use the Q&A function on Zoom, commonly found at the bottom of the screen and where your Zoom controls are. Your questions will be answered at the end of this webinar after the presentations are over. Please keep your microphone muted to avoid distraction for our panelists. We also welcome you to write your introduction, your organization, and contact information, and any other links relevant to this topic today in the chat box. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded on our YouTube, which is Zero Waste Asia's YouTube. And in case of any technical issues, please reach out to any of us present here today via the chat box. Next slide. And now, to get us started, it is my great pleasure to be joined today by Rocha, who is the Director of Global Plastics Program, GAIA, Ronald Steenblik, Senior Technical Advisor from QUNO, Mayang Azurin, who is the Deputy Director for Campaigns Asia Pacific, GAIA, Nalini, Shekhar, Co-Founder and Executive Director, Hasiru, Dala. Our panelists will have about 10 minutes to present on their topic, and we will have Q&A afterwards. But feel free to write your questions as they speak. By the end of the webinar, we hope you will learn about existing financial resources spent to solve plastic crisis, but are only worsening this pollution, why they need significant overhaul, and what is actually needed. To start us off, we have Anna Rocha. Anna is GAIA's Director of Global Plastics Program, providing leadership and strategic vision to our international plastic policy work. She's an environmentalist who serves as an amplifier of voices from the global south to global engagements. She's Brazilian, but has been living permanently in Tanzania since 2010. Anna became an activist as a child during Rio 1992, the Earth Summit, and has built over 30 years of local, national, regional, and global advocacy. She's a zero-waste implementer and plastic advocate with over 15 years of service in grassroots organizations aiming to create positive systemic change in the waste sector and build the foundation for a socially just and climate resilient world. And it is my very pleasure to be working with her. She will be presenting on the topic of financing the Global Plastics Treaty. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Arpita. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be here and to join the Zero Waste Month celebration. Aspects of it. For people who are not familiar with the Global Plastics Treaty, we currently have under UNEP, which is the UN Environmental Program, a legally binding instrument to solve plastic pollution, including the marine environment. In the Global Plastic Treaty, these negotiations have started actually in 2022. And one of the main enablers of success is actually adequate and appropriate financial mechanisms. The financial mechanisms are needed for countries, member states, as they are called under the UN, to actually be able to do and take the measures that are necessary for the agreement to work. And so financial resources and mechanisms in multilateral agreements can include and must include a variety of items. So they must include financial support to the Secretariat. So when you have a multilateral agreement, with that multilateral agreement, we do have a Secretariat that is formed to basically coordinate that agreement and work on it. And the costs of that Secretariat are covered by the financial mechanisms. Also financial support to developing countries and economies in transition. So we need to ensure that especially in developing countries have the means to implement whatever is agreed in the multilateral agreement, and the enabling activities, which are the ones that are needed for that to happen, include capacity building and training, institutional strengthening, policy development, monitoring and reporting, pilot and demonstration projects as well, to be able to anticipate shortcomings before any ideas implemented at the large scale. It also includes incremental costs, which are basically costs associated with specific areas of implementation that require specific infrastructure. So, for example, if we decide to address microplastics in that agreement, you need to have the infrastructure necessary to filter the water from washing machines, for example. And also sustainable financing. So one of the main things about the multilateral agreement, and in the case of plastics specifically, is that there is a need to make it self-sustaining somehow. So the funding and the financing must include ways to collect funds at the national level, at the regional level, so that it can self-finance as we move to enable the long-term sustainability of it. Next slide, please. So with that, there are several types of financial financial mechanisms to be able to do that. And I'm not going to describe each one of them because it can become quite technical, but we have general trust funds, we have specialized trust funds, we have partnership-based program-specific trust funds, we have donor-based program-specific trust funds. And what we are actually recommending, and most of the Global South countries have been requesting, specifically for the Global Plastic Treaty, is for us to have a dedicated multilateral fund. So this is one that I'm going to talk a little bit more about, which is basically a financial mechanism tailored to the implementation of a single multilateral environmental agreement, in this case, the Plastics Treaty. So it's a financial mechanism that is dedicated to plastics and doesn't actually share coordination and administration with other agreements that already exist. And so that dedicated fund is supposed to deliver an easy implementation, an easy access to funds for governments that need it. And that I will emphasize again, developing countries and economies in transition as being the main beneficiaries of the financial mechanisms. And also compliance mechanisms that are basically doable for the variety of countries that we have under that multilateral agreement. I think the most successful example of a multilateral fund that uses a dedicated fund that is very successful is the Montreal Protocol, that I think many people here are familiar with. And that has been an example that has been frequently mentioned during the Plastic Treaty negotiations. And then we also have a multi-purpose multilateral fund, in the most, I think, known example being the GEF, which is the Global Environment Facility Trust Fund, which is basically a fund that manages several agreements in its own. So, for example, the GEF has the Minamata Convention and many other conventions under its management. Next slide, please. So what are we actually advocating for in the Global Plastic Treaty, as GAIA, as I think most of our allies actually are in agreement about, is again to establish a dedicated fund to ensure that the countries that are implementing the treaty can access adequate, stable, and predictable funding at the moment of ratification of the treaty. That's extremely important for several reasons. One of them being we cannot lose momentum. So as we are doing the negotiations, by the moment that we reach an agreement and we actually need to ratify that agreement, it's very important to not lose momentum and to have the structure in place as needed for countries to access funding and be able to do that. That includes, so if you think about the treaty work specifically and what is being pushed again, and if you want more information on this, there are many details. I think the presentation is going to be shared, but there is also a very good paper that was written by EIA, and that details different types of financial mechanisms. But I would like to highlight just two things. Next slide, please. One of them being the need to address the polluter pays principle, exactly because we need, as I mentioned before, we need to find ways for the implementation of the treaty to become self-sustaining financially at some point. And for that to happen, we basically need the people who are benefiting from plastic production and from plastic pollution as well to actually burden most of the costs of that implementation. And one example of this is Ghana's proposal. So Ghana, which is a country in Africa, they have submitted a proposal for the creation of a global plastic pollution fee that basically targets what they call the plastic pollution gap, which is the difference between the amount of plastics that is produced and the amount of plastic that can be managed with the existing infrastructure. So they call plastic producers to supply the finances necessary to create the infrastructure that is missing to be able to bridge that gap. And We don't know yet if this proposal is going to go forth or not, but in case it is, that's basically the strategy behind it. And then following slide, please. Under that also comes all the APR schemes that are usually covered in the treaty. And next slide, please. I think it hasn't changed yet. Yes, thank you. That are mentioned and referred to in the treaty. So EPR is obviously an area of focus for many countries. And we need to remember that, unfortunately, many of the EPR schemes that are currently implemented in countries are often ineffective voluntary agreements that ends up displacing waste pickers and small recycling companies or organizations that are managing plastic waste. And so we also have guidance on how the advocacy for a good APR scheme should be done, which includes, again, full financial responsibility for all costs to producers, government overseeing and actually piloting and managing the system, inclusion of waste pickers and other waste workers, meaningful inclusion in the system, and then uphold the waste hierarchy and making sure that the APR is not funding any kind of technology that is actually harmful to the environment, and that it follows something that I think everyone here is very familiar with, which is the zero waste principles. So with that, I would like to thank you all, and it was a pleasure to be here. I'll be here for questions later.
Thank you so much, Anna. I know it was a huge challenge to present so many different options for financing the treaty in such a short time, and I do appreciate that so much. Now moving on, we have a very different topic. We turn to our next presenter, Mr. Ronald Steenblik, and I am so excited to hear from him just because I managed to read some of his publications on subsidies, and I'm so curious myself to learn from him. And just to let you know, Ronald is a senior technical advisor of SJES program at QUNO in Geneva. Until 2018, he was also the special counselor for fossil fuel subsidy reform in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Trade and Agricultural Directorate, where he led fossil fuel subsidies reform effort. He also served as the chair of G20's volunteer peer reviews of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. From 2006 to 2007, he served as the first director of research for the Global Subsidies Initiative, a program developed by the International Institute for Sustainable Development to improve transparency on the size and effects of subsidies, especially those harming developing countries or the environment. And his over 40-year career includes private industry, municipal, state, federal governments, academic institutions, and intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations. He has made important contribution to the policy debate on subsidies to agriculture, biofuels, fishing, energy production, and of course, plastics now. Today, he'll be talking with us about the role of subsidies in exacerbating plastic pollution crisis by supporting growing production of primary plastic. Ron, over to you.
Yes, good morning, and thank you very much for providing me with this great opportunity. If my slides could be brought up. While that's happening, just to explain that the Quaker United Nations office, also called QUNO, is am I supposed to put up this? Okay, there you go. Yeah, is actually quite an old NGO from that works on activities related to promoting peace, but also more recently on sustainability. So yeah, what I want to talk about is the opposite or opposing flow of finance and money that's actually encouraging the expansion of primary plastic polymers, and those are, I mean, basically under the general category of subsidies. So the main types, what we're talking about is cheap credit from government led agencies. So these would be export credit agencies, multilateral and bilateral investment banks, government-owned domestic banks, and then various cheap finance via state-owned enterprises, which play a big role, particularly in the energy industry, but also in petrochemicals. There are many places, particularly exporting countries, that subsidize hydrocarbon feedstocks. The really big one in this case is ethane. I'll show you in a minute the extent of those subsidies. Subsidize process energy. So as probably many of you know, the creation of the manufacturing of plastic polymers is a very energy intensive process. It involves taking monomers, so which are basic chemicals, and then creating long polymer chains, and that takes a lot of energy, heating, cooling, and energy for pressure. Just continuing from the previous slide, and in some countries like the United States, there are incentives provided at the subnational level. And for example, the plant depicted here was a big Shell plant in Southwest Pennsylvania, which has only recently come online. I believe it's a $6 billion investment, and it benefited from over $1.6 billion in state and local incentives. Particularly tax incentives. Next slide, please. Yeah. So in the next slide, it's just to give an overall picture of these different flows. So you, of course, have support for oil and natural gas extraction, often investment type of support for oil refining, and then out of the oil or the natural gas processing plants, governments often intervene in the price of the products coming out of that. And so in looking at the hydrocarbon fuels themselves, natural gas or electricity produced from fossil fuels or oil, that provides the energy for the polymer production and for the cracking, which is breaking apart chemicals like naphtha or ethane to then create other chemicals. And in addition, you have the inputs to that, the physical chemicals, molecules that eventually become polymers, that are often underpriced. And then, as I mentioned before, you also have the cheap finance that goes to finance these cracking plants and polymer manufacturing plants. So I don't know if you can see it, but there's a light circle around the cracking and polymer plants. When we talk about subsidies to primary plastics production, we're talking about those stages. I mean, we shouldn't ignore the upstream, but basically that's a different discussion that's happening in different fora about subsidies to fossil fuels themselves. Next slide. So I mentioned cheap prices for chemicals that become eventually polymers, and ethane is one of the most important ones. It's extracted from natural gas. It also is a byproduct of cracking naphtha, which comes from petroleum refineries. And this shows the price trajectory over the most recent period I was able to find information on in the United States and Saudi Arabia. In the United States, those prices benefit also from incentives upstream for producing natural gas, but it's still more or less a market price. And you see in the case of Saudi Arabia, the government intervenes and sets the price for ethane, and it's much lower than the price in the United States. We suspect that this is happening in other Gulf producing states and maybe elsewhere. But one of the problems is getting information on the prices of these feedstocks. which are collected by some private companies that then sell the data. And it's very expensive to obtain that data. And also, then you are limited in what you can present on it. These data come from a public website displayed by Intratech. Next slide. Just to give you an idea of how much that is worth, in the case of Saudi Arabia, there was a study done a few years ago looking at comparing the marginal cost of ethane with the actual domestic price of ethane, and that estimated that that the value to the petrochemical industry of low-cost ethane was $3.8 billion in 2019. That would have been at the end of the previous graph, but that was in dollars of 2009. Converting that to dollars of 2023, that's over $5.4 billion. That's just one country, okay? And just for feedstock costs. That's not counting the price of the subsidies to process energy. So we estimate that that globally the value of subsidies to primary plastic production is at least in the tens of billions of dollars a year. Next slide. Again, we haven't been able to collect data yet on the value of low-cost process energy to plastics plants, but this gives an idea of where it might occur. Now, again, the policies for chemical feedstocks and for process energy for polymerization plants may be different than what it is for other industries. But in general, you can see that this chart shows the largest producers from a few years ago of the world, and which ones are benefiting from low-priced oil or natural gas. And we see that as China, Saudi Arabia, India, Chinese Taipei to a small extent, Thailand to a small extent, Iran in a big way, and then particularly Indonesia. Next slide. Now, turning to finance, this is from a really great study that was published last year. What they did was they looked at public and private financing of large petrochemical plants that involved at least $1 billion of investment. And you can see on the left, it may be a bit difficult to read, they looked at how much private investment went into these plants and how much public investment. You see the public investment was, let's say 15% of the total investment, and that might not seem all that much, but that the public supported or backed investment has a leveraging effect and a signaling effect to private investors, showing that yes, the government agencies believe this is a worthwhile investment, and they're guaranteeing what they're putting into it. So that helps lower the overall cost of capital for investors in these plants. And you can see that the largest category by far of petrochemical plants that benefited from this type of investment were produced either plastics exclusively or plastics along with something else. Next slide. So how much was that? Well, there's an NGO called Oil Change International, which follows public financing of fossil fuel plants, but also petrochemical plants, but only through multilateral investment banks and bilateral banks and export credit. So they're not looking at domestic financing, but even there you can see that it's in several billion dollars a year in terms of the face value of the financing. Now, that's not necessarily the subsidy value, but it shows that there's something there and bears further investigation. Final slide, I believe. yeah, just to conclude that what can be done about this? Well, we're hoping that particularly if discussion of the production side stays in the treaty discussions, that will also include some what we call disciplines, so rules restricting the use of subsidies, particularly for new plants in the plastics treaty. There are also other parallel efforts, for example, in the Convention on Biological Diversity to try to limit environmentally harmful subsidies. We certainly consider subsidies to plastics production an environmentally harmful one. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ron, for that very interesting, albeit a little bit technical presentation. I do imagine a lot of questions coming in, and just hearing you and all of those massive investments in production was so difficult to even understand and hear. Anyway, now let's move on to our next presenter, who is Nalini Shekhar. Nalini is the co-founder and executive director of Hasiru, Dala, with over 3 decades of work in the informal waste management sector. She's embodied the dignity of marginalized communities and empowering their agency. As executive director of Hasiru, Dala, Nalini believes strongly in multi-stakeholder advocacy and participatory decision-making. Over the years, she has trained hundreds of waste pickers on new ways of solid waste management and helped develop their skill to become waste management professionals. In addition, she has worked with state officials, students, and citizens, creating awareness on the need of sustainable waste management and integration of waste pickers. As an advocate for just transition for waste pickers, Nalini is one of the foremost experts at the international level on environmental justice and waste management, contributing to policy and research on integrating the informal sector. And I can vouch for it, given that witnessing Nalini's engagement in the plastics treaty negotiations. Over to you, Nalini, who will be sharing her experiences leading the organization and the financial principles for a just transition for waste pickers.
Thank you so much. You can hear, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the first time I are openly talking about what is the principles of finance mechanism for inclusion of just not waste picker but the whole waste sector, informal waste sector. This is a work in progress, and love to hear your feedbacks and move ahead. So the first couple of slides I'm going to skip because it's about our organization. I don't want to spend too much time. Can you just move to the next slide and next slide? This is about us. We work in about 18 cities and 64 villages in Karnataka state. And majorly our role is to facilitate, not represent waste picker, but facilitate representation of waste pickers and create an ecosystem. Next one, please. I'm just not going to spend too much time. And we had recently done a GHD study promoting decentralized waste management in just about 8 wards, and 8 entrepreneurs have created this amazing impact. Go to the next. We can send you the link for the study. Go to the next one, please. Okay. This is what I really wanted to kind of talk about. I'm specifically doing much more minor and minute kind of discussion today on how it actually can implement or impacts the on the ground effect. So when we are just looking at many financial mechanisms that has come recently, including our own India has a green credit system that they have created. It's we have to yet to use it and move ahead. We have looked at plastic credits. We have looked at carbon credits, and all these are voluntary market, of course. And we have been also talking to government what they can help us in terms of integration of waste pickers. So that I'll be talking. And some of the things that we have commonly seen in all these instruments is the talk about additionality. So that is a common and minimum requirement in all financing mechanism, and it doesn't recognize the historical contribution of informal sector. I'll talk about it a little bit. It's highly formalized process. So it creates a high entry barriers to uneducated but highly efficient informal supply chain. And in the informal supply chain, you have high volumes of recovery. But if this kind of conditions are there and not inclusive, then lot of economic incentives through financing mechanism will be lost by the informal sector. And also all these that we have looked at doesn't talk, it talks about labor standard, but it's not a priority. They are just looking at only environmental, which is good, but they also have to at the same time also address labor standards, which is often not a priority. It mentions these should be there, but that is not taken into consideration for your ratings or and other things. Go to the next one, please. So I really want to talk about what is this additionality about. This is an example, and I really want all of us to think whether it is a fair thing. See, all the DW, Dry Waste Collection Center, is what we call MRF in Karnataka. And all the informal entrepreneurs give it to the one traditional old aggregator, right? So, but this is the present system. Go to the next slide, please. When you really look at how things are moving in the voluntary sector at this point of time, so if the DWCC and informal sector who is giving to the old aggregator, who is the old traditional format, then they say, no, you cannot do that. Because he needs to get an additionality. But the same material moves to a new aggregator. It is, let me clearly tell you, it is not a new material. It is not material that was not taken care of, but it is going to the new aggregator. Who are these new aggregators? The young professionals who have come recently to this field. Very professionally they talk, and they give you a lot of nice slides to talk about how important it is to work with the informal sector. But the movement of the material is the same. So is this fair? So material movement is same, the aggregator is different. Then they say, okay, this is additionality to this particular new person, so they are eligible. So that is not fair. That is what we have been talking about. Next one, please. So when you really look at, this is our first impression of gaps in this kind of systems. So if you look at these gaps, how do we plug in the new mechanisms that are going to come? So there is a high volume collection in the informal sector. And when you look at data management, okay, they can do it. Traceability, they're okay. The intermediary groups, it could be an NGO, it could be another group. They have a, little bit of a, they can get the volume, but not really, what informal sector, for example, in most of the people in Bangalore, the aggregator do anywhere between 50 and 60 ton, the new aggregator in a day. But informal sector, plastic in Bangalore alone, the trading is at 3,500 kilo. That is 3.5, 35,000 tons a day. And versus the 50 tons and 40 tons, you're talking about the newly formed group. So you can see the disparity and the quantum of waste that comes through. Next slide, please. So when you look at all the, accreditation that is required, monitoring and verification report, emission reduction and removal calculation, or financial ability to complete all these processes, of course, the informal sector is not there. While the support intermediary and technical consultant are on the high rank. All these technical consultants are coming into the space to the intermediary group and say, we will do all your paperwork and do it. You take, we take 30%, you take 70%. You take 60%, we take 40% of the credits. So this is the kind of voluntary market that is this. Well, volume and value comes from the informal waste sector. But financial and tech ability is with the intermediary and technical consultant. What we really need is a level playing field. So what do you mean by level playing field? We have next 2 slides, I'll be talking about it. One, what a government can do in all the negotiations they are doing in bringing in money to the government system. And also I'm going to talk about what a private sector can do. The next one, please. So we have been talking to the government about this. We have presented this to 1 or 2 people and they're really looking at it. So there are a lot of compliance issue. Even Hasiru Dala, where we do boards with MLP as a small project, we have not been able to get EPR because the systems of applying applications and the compliance is so high. Even though compliance is done, we are still not got the certificate because we don't bribe, right? So there are a lot of challenges in the informal sector. One of the studies we did, this is an informal sector who was doing the processing of plastic, and he says, "Madam, I don't know to read and write. So I need one clerk, that is one person as an administrative person, but I hire 4 people because I don't know to read and write, but I don't want to be held hostage." So he spends that 4 people's salary, but he cuts on the salary that he used to give it to the labor. So what we are saying here is, can we look at shared resources for providing these services? Like we have about 30 drivers collection center, they have to do labor compliance, they have to do company compliance. What we have done is we have empaneled a few people who can help them out so that the cost will also be less for the informal sector, and also the business is more in terms of number to the service provider. So what are the different kinds of resources are we talking about? Well, help with the pollution compliance with the technology, then help with the process of pollution control board, for example, labor compliance, and what are the different kinds of financial schemes that is already there in the system? How can we leverage that requires different department to collaborate with each other? Then what is the income tax and Ministry of Corporate Affairs? That is a company register, people who are registered under company, so they can be supportive. So, so these are some of the things. And next slide, please. And my power is going, just, so we are also looking at what can a private sector do, because the private sector right now is in the is sorry, my electricity was going. So the private sector right now, because it is in a voluntary area where this is happening, these are the investment that definitely they need to give. Looking at how do we actually tell and inform, how do we do this awareness building up in financial mechanism, the ecosystem that is being developed, which if they are not part of, they are out of it. How do we support a feasibility study? Feasibility study is such a simple thing, but you need big people or consultants to come and do it for us. How do we build data collection capacity? How do you handle, implementation of the compliance and credibility? Then we have to also, the private sector also should talk about, private sector doesn't mean just a corporate. Could be NGOs, which could be labor organization, environmental organization. How do we work with the policy engagement to access this finance mechanism? So we really have to build a collaborative network to create this kind of ecosystem. So what I want to say is when we are talking about international finance mechanism, we really have to look at how we can bring all these aspects to forefront. So I'll close that. That's my last slide. Thank you for saying that I'm up with the time, and definitely will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Nalini. This has been very, very useful, I do imagine, for most of our participants, and we look forward to some questions for you. And now we move on to our last but not the least presentation. We have our very own Mayang Azurin. Mayang will be speaking on financing of fall solutions by international financing institutions. Mayang is, of course, the GAIA Asia Pacific's Deputy Director for Campaigns, where she leads the network's Divest campaign, urging IFIs in the region to shift their investments away from false solutions. Before joining GAIA, she coordinated Global South-led civil society networks and holding international financial institutions accountable to human rights and the environment. Over to you, Mayang.
Thank you, Arpita. I'll be speaking without a PowerPoint. We have major technical issues in this room. But there is one slide that I have, which is I think one of the most important parts of this presentation, is that international financial institutions, well, all of them, most of them have committed to stop funding fossil fuels and divest in fossil fuels. Research suggests that, or shows, this is from the Energy Policy Tracker.org, that during 2021 to 2022, around 3.2 billion on direct fossil fuel finance, 2 years, it was 2022 to 2022, for fossil fuel and recovery packages. So remember, at this time, we were on a global shutdown. Economies were closing down, but as we see here, this is for gas and oil. As we see here in the slides, the major banks bailed out the fossil fuel industry during this period when we were unsure about our future, when we were all talking about green recovery. So EIB, World Bank Group, Asian Development Bank, EBRD, IADB, AIIB, Islamic Development Bank, African Development Bank, all pushed for bailing out this industry, oil and gas, which are raw materials for the petrochem, which manufactures plastic. So we can see that after those years, they have tried to pivot. Most of them pivot from plastic production, the petrochemical industry, because the energy consumption were getting low. Economies were closed at that time. So if you see the gray area is fossil conditional, meaning, and they are very low in this slide, very small money, which means fossil conditional means climate finance or money for the fossil industry that has to have climate targets and pollution abatement targets. The rest, the black ones, are just our money, subsidies, loan packages, recovery packages, while the small and medium enterprises didn't have as much money as this. They are unconditional. Just move on. This is the money. It's yours to continue. So that's the situation in the past 3 years. And if we remember, in 2015, IFIs committed to improving or raising the funds for low carbon financing, for climate finance, but it's not happening. In the upstream of the plastic industry, oil and gas are being supported. Now, the second message that I want, probably the most important message that has to be put, is that IFIs also, and we can take down that slide. Right. IFIs are leaders in policy and investment landscaping. So in the past, let's say 10 years, we see climate change grow into other smaller forms of financing, where false solutions for plastic pollution have been entering. One of this is the small relative of the climate change financing is ocean health finance, or they call blue finance, where waste incineration is being seen as solution to stop leakage of solid waste from the to the ocean. So we see this in Maldives, 73 billion of funds for the waste to energy in Maldives. This is co-funded by AIB and Asian Development Bank. Sorry, that's 73 million. And then we know that this is not appropriate because 70% of that waste is organic. So they're trying to push these false solutions in ocean, in these blue funds. And then there's the other framework that they're promoting, which is also close to ocean or blue financing, is the circular economy under also climate change, which in many policy briefs or in their frameworks, they would say, at least World Bank would say, it should start with minimization of waste, recycling, proper collection, recycling, reuse, and then waste to energy or recovery of waste into recovery of energy from waste. But ADB is, some banks like ADB would never even touch minimization of waste. They would package circular economy as a disposal issue. So they would talk about circular economy and how to begin by recovering energy from waste. And we know that in Asian contexts where waste is mostly wet, this is an inappropriate solution. And we know that banks are mandated with or are controlled by political interests as well, economic and political interests as well. As Japan, China, they're trying to export their technologies to other countries because their local markets are already closing, are already saturated, while US and Europe are also finding other markets in other developing countries, because incineration, they find that incineration is already inappropriate in their countries. Plus, they are also looking at the increasing demand for closing plastic pollution, as the global plastics treaty is up in the agenda. They're all trying to make justification for continued production through waste to energy. And then there's also a new thing. Of course, other financing is clean energy, renewable energy, and we saw refuse-derived fuel, waste to energy being funded in those funding mechanisms. But there's a new one, the just transition financing, which is the center of climate finance now. Billions of dollars being funneled to just transition finance, but we are seeing this as a just transition for fossil fuel dependent industries like the petrochem, oil, gas, and the petrochem industry. Actually, the concept of transition financing is that we provide funds for those who may not transition because it's expensive. So they are the ones being supported, and not the workers, not the waste pickers, who need to be supported by financing, skilling, and other support. If we see the financing right now, it's all in the energy sector, and nothing in those financing talk about the requirements for mitigating the impacts to the labor industry and labor, formal and informal, that's going to be impacted. So, and thirdly, lastly, these projects, how many minutes do still I have? 2 minutes. Lastly, the most important thing is that these projects are being implemented with deliberate violations of human rights and environmental conventions. There are many projects that we are monitoring in GAIA. We have the Philippines, where ADB supported the technical assistance. Even there is a ban on waste to energy incineration. There's the Maldives, where meaningful consultations was not observed, and the scoping of the environmental impact assessment was inadequate. And then the Bindung in Vietnam waste to energy project is also a violation of their own energy policy, because they approved it without the required guidance notes for waste to energy. But there is one project that I think is coming out, and more of these kinds of projects, will be in the financing modalities here. I'm speaking about the Indorama Blue Loan project. It's a 4-country project, but the plant is in Thailand. So this project is $100 million, and it's the same Indorama we're talking about that's in Spain, in Nigeria. So this one is the subsidiary. And what we found out in the safeguards document is that the safeguards officer wrote, they found mercury, lead, and the corrective action is to validate if it's hazardous. If you find lead and mercury, everybody knows that this is hazardous. But the corrective action plan is very inadequate. It doesn't say stop the production, close the plant for now until the error has been corrected. Third, another is that around 28 workers are reporting lung disorders. They have high lead content in their blood. They have hearing impairments. In two years, there were fires and spillage and other violations. There are also volatile organic compounds that were reported, but it was never identified as a means to close the plant. And what's even shocking is that the recommendation is that the conclusion is that there is no violation of any laws, and that the CSR is implemented even when the environmental plan was not communicated to the community, and there's no grievance mechanism for the workers. So this is the kind of implementation that we have now. The challenge for us is when we propose for a new multilateral environmental mechanism, this is the same IFIs we're talking about, the same IFIs that are willing to save the companies, the corporations, the petrochem industry to pivot at the risk of people and the environment. So we have to make a global plastics treaty, a strong global plastics treaty with clear exclusions on oil, gas, and production of virgin plastics, because their own laws, their own safeguards, policies, they can violate them. And they run without being accountable because they have immunity. So this is where I end. I hope this I've shared some vital information.
Thank you so much, Mayang, and thank you for adjusting with various technical issues that I know you've been encountering today. And now we move on to the most weighted section, I believe, on the Q&A from the audiences. We had 3 questions I could see in the Q&A section that Ron has already written answers to. So I'll move on to some of the other questions that we've received, and then circle back on those same questions if somebody wants to add. All right. This is for Anna. What can be done to ensure CBDR principle is not applied to provisions other than finance, given that many developing countries are looking for exemptions both on the material to phase out as well as the timelines? And also that certain developed countries are not keen to accept the disproportionate responsibility that they have for plastic pollution.
This is a great question, and actually one that we have been trying to address. So CBDR is an important aspect to be included when it comes to means of implementation. So we need to recognize that different countries have different capacities and need different resources to be able to address the issues at face, but not when it comes to control measures. So we are not hoping to keep certain countries at lower standards than others, we actually believe, I personally believe that the global south countries, the developing countries, can actually enable proper implementation and higher standards. We don't need to follow the path that has been established by the economy that we currently have in place, and we can be creative. We can use our background, our history, to actually propose better solutions than the ones that we have at hand. So what we are advocating is specifically with when it comes to CBDR in the treaty and with member states that everyone, I think, can join, is CBDR in means of implementation, yes. CBDR in control measures, no.
That's very helpful and very brief. I really appreciate it. Now moving on to another question, which is for Nalini. Nalini, in your opinion, what support, how can a balance be reached between private sector's intentions to formalize waste pickers or to develop a parallel waste logistics chain through producer responsibility organizations and via EPR schemes that's happening in India and across Asia in certain cases, with the ability for waste pickers to be financially supported through private sector funding?
So this whole thing of formalization has to be re-looked at. We call it professionalization because 30,000 people are there and you can't formalize everybody. And formalization often referred to as being in certain confined area with all the employment benefits, but we do not have that many jobs for sure. So we have to re-look at how do we professionalize them through entrepreneurship, or even they owning, processing or reuse economy is another big area that they can be included. So those are some of the places we can really look at how to in the collection system. Of course, the government is very much involved in the government in the thing. Definitely, there is a PPP model possible, that is PPP with waste pickers and the government, not big guys. When that happens, which has happened in Bangalore and many other cities in Karnataka and in India, that is where the support can come from the private sector. And another thing that we really want to explore with the private sector is to look at the shared services I talked about. How can we actualize that shared services? I've been talking about it, nobody has done it, so we decided we are going to implement it next year to demonstrate how that can be worked out. That kind of shared services for compliance will take them a long way. So those are two things that I can immediately think of. But private sector coming and saying, I'll give you gloves, it doesn't work. You have to give in a systematic way that is sustainable. And even the finance mechanism for running their businesses.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that response. I have another question that I would like to have responses from everyone. Given the massive public money is going into supporting proliferation of petrochemicals and plastic production, and all of you talked about it in different ways, what can ordinary citizens who are not aware of the massive amounts of money pooled in billions and billions of dollars can actually do to challenge this trend? And I want to start with Ron.
Hi. Yeah. Individuals addressing this. Well, we've seen in the case of the fossil fuel subsidies that there has been, I mean, probably the biggest examples in the Netherlands recently, where there were massive demonstrations against fossil fuel subsidies provided by in the Netherlands. I mean, a lot of these were basically exemptions for different industries, including the airline industry, from taxes, but that definitely had a big effect. I'm not suggesting that that there's likely to be as big of a public reaction that would lead to that kind of action in many countries. But I mean, people could still write to letters to editors and newspapers, bring more attention to the issue on social media, contact their government agencies that provide the type of support we're talking about, and contact organizations like Oil Change International, encourage them or even donate to them to try to get better information. So, for example, in the case of Oil Change International, they have concentrated, like I said, on international flows of public finance, and they want to turn to providing more of their own staff to look into domestic flows of such finance, but you know, that requires money and time to engage staff on that. So, or people could volunteer to do that kind of research in their country and feed into organizations such as the OCI.
Thank you so much. I know this was sort of a very difficult question to answer, but one that we often hear. Over to you, Anna, the same question.
I think that's a very frequent question when it comes to the plastics conversation, and it comes specifically to the plastic treaty, is how people that are not there, don't have the negotiation power, cannot make decisions on behalf of their countries, cannot necessarily participate in the process, can actually play a role in general. And that goes with the push for to reduction on or elimination of subsidies, also goes with the kinds of waste technologies that we accept or we don't accept. So there are many layers to this. The truth is that if we didn't have a movement that is so strong and keeps bringing up the harm of plastic pollution, the importance of addressing the plastic crisis, if people are not paying attention and being loud about it, we wouldn't probably have a plastic treaty being negotiated right now. You need to remember, I think something that people frequently don't realize is that the fact that we have a plastic treaty being negotiated is such a win for the environmentalists. What we are talking about is basically having a negotiation that goes against the major powers that we have in the world, the major industries, the most powerful industries, people, governments. And we have the treaty. And the reason why we have the treaty being negotiated is because a lot of people spent a lot of energy on saying, I want to solve the plastic crisis, go there and do something about it. And so the negotiations happen, and there is a whole technical piece of the treaty that happens through this process, but that is not the beginning and not the end of the work. Anything that is agreed in that negotiation room will have to be implemented at the national level, at the regional level. And that will only happen with engagement of people at the national level and regional level. Anything that happens in that room, like any outcome that is actually not desirable, will also only be blocked at the national and the regional level if we have people working on that and being loud about it. Then the movement building aspect, which is how we can basically engage with each other to make sure that our concerns and our vision, like our world, like what I think what we are trying to build here is a vision for an economy, for a world, for how we want things to be. That's something that we can only construct collectively and push collectively. So I would say there is a lot of opportunity for engagement.
Absolutely. And folks who don't know Anna is brilliant at always giving us hope through this very difficult work that we do. So I really appreciate that. And now I want to pass to Mayang, who is also with us, to talk a little bit about the IFI's work that she leads for our office. in GAIA Asia Pacific, and specifically a little bit about the ADB campaign that folks can participate in. Mayang, over to you.
Unmute myself. All right. For the IFI work, people can start holding their governments accountable for the decisions that they make, the votes their governments make in the international financial institutions. We can learn from the climate movement. It's decades of work. It's grassroots organizing, massive education. And as I agree with Anna, if it was not because of the noise, the demand that people were asking, there's not going to be a global plastics treaty in discussion. But there are also lessons from the climate finance or climate change that we can learn from. It's not enough that we have a treaty. It's the after work. It's the monitoring of where the financing goes. It's actually setting the standards high. I've heard one that we've been watching funding for renewable energy, but nobody really, there's little action on how far have IFIs are divesting from false solutions, from false solutions to climate, to waste. And that's the thing that we can start also doing. We can start looking at projects that are that builds collaboration with human rights, environmental groups, climate change, air quality actors, and build that momentum to watch one project or several projects that can call IFIs to really stop false solutions to plastic pollution. And I feel like if it's not a strong global plastics treaty, at the end of the day, the empowerment, the discussions, the public discourse are very important. At the end of the day, it's still the governments that are going to vote. And it's the discourse, the collaboration at the grassroots level that's at the end of the day going to be sustainable, the partnerships that we've made. But of course, in financing, we have to show that where we want money to go, it's reclaiming our money. Now IFIs are just thinking that it's their money. When you say it's public money, they like sort of shocked with what you're saying. They forgot about that this is actually public money and we have to reclaim it.
Thank you so much, Mayang. And I hope if any of the IFIs, private sectors watching this, they understand that we know what's happening, and we know and we are going to continue this fight for justice and access. Thank you so much to everyone and to our brilliant panelists for speaking about so much of their work. And one thing I wanted to highlight before I go, given that I work in the plastics treaty as well, is to access our plastics treaty resources going by using this QR code. And we have lots of resources, different submissions that we have made so far, our recommendation on just transition, financial resources, EPR, and many other things. So please feel free to visit this, and also feel free to visit our Zero Waste Month.Asia website. I do want to acknowledge that while we have participation from folks across the globe, our focus and our speakers today spoke from their experiences in the Asia Pacific region as well as from Europe. So that has been a limitation, but we will try to address all of your concerns. Feel free to keep sending us the questions, and we will write back to all our registered participants as well as our members by addressing those questions and sharing these slides, the resourceful slides as well as many publications that the many amazing speakers talked about. You can access our resources, and on the next slide, please, we have the contact information of our speakers, or the GAIA team, and also of Ron. Thank you again for making time to be present here, and hopefully we will see you again with another insightful discussion on plastic pollution and exposing false solutions. Keep up the good fight, folks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.